the next
Can I use this table?
Illo Humphrey, with whom I've known for a number of years now, as we explained before. And I had the privilege of being on the jury of its habilitation at Paris Nanterre, which was a very, as I said earlier, it was the greatest punishment of my life, having had to read an enormous thesis.
Yeah, that's 6,000 pages, I remember.
There were 6 members of the jury, and I don't know how many hours we spent debating, and finally granted Illo with the highest degree, the highest reward we could give him. Now, today, Illo is going to speak about something remarkable. It's about the Carolingian period of music, and especially with an illumination of David Rex for Pepin, which is a very famous illustration from the first Bible, Charles the Bald, dating from the 9th century, as we see it on the screen. And I think it would be pointless to go any further with any explanation of what's going to happen, because after all, I'm not paid for speaking right now, but Illo is.
So, I'm going to make this as succinct as possible. It's, as you can see from this image, it's very complex. We won't go into every single minute detail, but we're going to give you the quintessential elements of this Carolingian illumination, which comes out of the second Carolingian Renaissance. The first Carolingian Renaissance is, of course, was started by the father of Charlemagne, whose name was Charles Martel, and he died, of course, in the year 768, and Charlemagne became king of the Franks with his twin brother, or his almost twin brother, let's say Carloman, who died soon after. Charlemagne continued this Carolingian Renaissance. It was as Charlemagne was he was a dictator, but he was an enlightened dictator. He was he had his side of sort of a, how shall I say it? He was pretty sanguinaire, bloody. He was a bloody dictator. But he also had a side of his personality that was tender and that was yearning to educate this great mass of people in his kingdom and in his empire as of the 25th of December, the year 800, when he became emperor in Rome, crowned by the Pope Leon III. The personage in the middle of this picture is one of Charlemagne's grandsons, whose name was Charles II, called Charles the Bald. Charles the Bald was the son of Louis the Pious, who was one of the sons of Charlemagne, of one of his 9 different wives. Charlemagne had about 80 children, and he was, as most potentates of his day, polygamous and so forth. But he redeems himself because he looked after the vast empire, the Carolingian Empire, and he made sure that the children of the schools of the vast Carolingian Empire received an adequate education. This is why 5-6 centuries later, when the University of Paris was founded in the year 1160 and confirmed maybe 100 years later by the papal bull, Charlemagne is considered the patron of the University of Paris. Now, with that preamble, which gives you, it was a necessary preamble, I'm going to try and go pretty quickly. So you have here an outline of my mini lecture. This pedagogical mini lecture on the Carolingian philosophy of iconography, namely on the well-known illumination David, Rex, et Propheta, is sixfold. The six closely interrelated capitula, that means chapters, briefly developed here are as follows. A brief introduction on the Ordo Palati, which means the royal and imperial Carolingian network of monasteries and cathedrals. This is it has a double. This Ordo Palatio has a double utilization, a double role. It is a political role and it's also a cultural role. In other words, all great statesmen like Marcus Aurelius and Charlemagne and so forth, they have an understanding that of the power of culture. Culture is not just something that you do to have pleasure. Power is a political tool. This is Charlemagne. He understands it. And Julius Caesar understood this. All of the, they understood this. Culture. The Hitler regime understood this, but it was, of course, went very sour. But they understood this. Culture is a political tool, and necessarily so. Okay. The Ordo Palatio. Remember that. That's important. It's a network of the different monasteries and cathedrals in what we call the Neustria, the northern part of France, down to the Loire, the valley of the Loire. Okay? Number two, the first Bible of Charles de Vaux. This comes from the first Bible of Charles de Vaux, this illumination that you just saw, which is Paris, Bibliothèque Nationale, Fond Latin, number one. It's the number one manuscript of the Latin collection. Fond Latin in French means Latin collection, which was done at the Abbey of Saint-Martin de Tours, and it's on folio 215 verso, which is the frontispiece of the Book of Songs. This is not, we are absolutely in the heart of the musical iconography of the Second Carolingian Renaissance. Okay. Number three, the philosophy of numbers and proportions, the philosophy of musical sound. All of this is subtly in this illumination. What do I mean? The illumination itself is a proportion of 1 to 1.32 or 1.33, which means that it has the proportion of a perfect fourth. It is also, and when you make subtle comparisons of all of the different objects and subtle triangles and so forth, parallelograms and so forth, in this mandorla, you will find that there is a subtle philosophy of numbers that is applied, and also a subtle philosophy of musical sound. Because as we know, Boethius told us this, he taught us this. He says that all things in the universe, whatsoever they are conceived through the logic of numbers. I'm going to get back to that concept later. Okay. We shall continue. The philosophy of Carolingian iconography and its proto-philology. You know, that's one of my favorite neologisms, proto-philology. What does this mean? It simply means archaeology. But the word archaeology has such a connotation, a historical, defined, solid connotation. I thought maybe it would be better to invent a new term and say proto-philology, where literary and literature and iconography and music are concerned. Okay? So please be indulgent with me on this sort of, as they say in French, barbarisme, this barbaric term, proto-philology, which has its value. Next, the Summa Bona, or the Quatuor Virtutes Animae, or the Quatuor Virtutis Cardinale, which you will find in this image: Prudentia, Justitia, Temperantia, and Fortitudo. They're up in the corners, and you don't see it here. You have to get very close. At every image, there's the name of the person. And here, over here, is Prudentia, Justitia, Temperantia, Fortitudo. And this is what is called in Latin the Summa Bona. It's also called, according to the different epochs, it's also called Le Quatuor Virtutes Animae, which means, of course, the four forces of the soul. And it's also called the Quatuor Virtutis Cardinalis, the four cardinal virtues. And this is one of the silver linings that is coming down all the way from Plato, from generation to generation, who has dedicated tons and tons of treatises on this concept. And it's all in that picture. This picture is extraordinary. It all comes from Plato's laws. Plato calls it ta agatha, very simple, to agathon, which is good. It's the good, or the adjective good. Plato calls it ta agatha, which is the plural, the goods. And he gives us, he declines it. I phronesis ke I hygia, wisdom and hygiene. I sophrosini ke tokalos, temperance and beauty. Idikeosini ke iixis, justice and power. I Andreia ke I Plutos, courage and wealth. In our illumination, they don't give the double. In fact, from one after Plato, no one ever gives the second aspect. Plato only gives you the double aspect. And in order to learn this, you've got to go back to Plato, go back to the original, the oldest manuscript containing the laws, which is found at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, manuscript Fond Grec, the Greek collection, 1807. And this manuscript dates from 865. In other words, it was copied in 865 in Byzantium by an unknown copyist. And the original from that manuscript was probably thrown in the trash. It may have been in papyrus, it may have been in parchment in bad condition, who knows? It dates from 865. The 9th century. I close that parenthesis. It's important to know that. When I included this as chapter 15 of my PhD thesis, I spent thousands of hours meditating. I had spent years meditating on this image. And I said, my goodness. I began to understand, and I began to ask questions to my friends who were art historians, and they corroborated my initial findings. And I began to delve into this, and I saw, as we all do, when you delve into a thing, you do the inventory of the research, and you see the lacunae of certain predecessors that studied this image. No one had ever taken it as far back to Plato and his laws, enumi. No one. They take it as of, in fact, they will take it back to Aristotle. And Aristotle does not call these four virtues, or these double virtues, these 8 virtues, he calls them arete. He changes the terms. Well, of course, Plato, and I will close this parenthesis, Plato changes terms as well. Plato, who learned from the Pythagoreans all of his knowledge on music and mathematics, called the octave, not as the Pythagoreans called it, I harmonia. He called it I diapason. I diapason. He changed the entire vocabulary. So it's not surprising that Aristotle changed the vocabulary of his master himself, because Plato did the same. Okay, this is important, this little preamble, this little introduction. And then finally, I'm going to talk to you about this important document which emanates from Charlemagne, which is called the Admonitio Generalis, which is the political cultural document that made into law the blueprint of the basic imperial education based on the 7 liberal arts. And who drafted this up? None other than his Minister of Education and Culture, Alcuinus Efboricensis, that is to say, Alcuin of York, the British-born erudite man. And he was called by the biographer of Charlemagne, Aeginhardus. He said of Alcuinus, vir undecumque doctoris. He said he is a man in all respects completely erudite and a doctor of all respects. In 795, he was assigned by Charlemagne, more or less forced. He wanted to go back home to York. He was tired of it. Oh, I'm fed up with all this politics. And Charlemagne said, I'll make a little effort. And he was assigned to be the lay abbot of Saint Martin of Tours, the Benedictine Abbey, from whence came this magnificent illumination. And it was he who was the last, two of his last great students were Rabanus Maurus of Fulda and Amalarius of Metz. Amalarius was the historian of liturgy, and Rabanus Maurus was the, how shall we say it, le polymath. He was the German erudite monk. They were two of his last students before he died in 804. Okay. Now, after that, I'm going to begin to make a little musical pause, and I shall sing for you the Te Deum Laudamus, which is a pre-Gregorian chant. You can follow along. I gave you a very detailed. It's important to be able to take home with oneself a detailed program when you go to a concert. And Gregorian chant is even much more rare today than it was 30 or 40 years ago. So you've got to explain many things. So there, I've given you some very fine, minute details. As I sing, you can read them leisurely. Te Deum laudamus, te Dominum confitemur, te eternum Patrem, omnis terra veneratur, tibi omnes angeli, tibi celi et universe potestates, tibi cherubim et seraphim, in cessabili voce proclamant, Sanctus, 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 Dominus Deus Sabaoth, pleni sunt celi et terra, majestatis gloriae tuae. Te gloriosus apostolorum chorus, te prophetarum laudabilis numerus, te martyrum candidatus laudat exercitus, te per orbem terrarum sancta confitetur ecclesia, Patrem immense majestatis venerandum tum verum et unicum filium. Sanctum quoque paraclitum spiritum tur ex gloriae Christe. Tu Patris sempiternus es Filius, tu ad liberandum suscepturus hominem, non horuisti virginis uterum, tu de victo mortis aculeo, aperuisti credentibus regna celorum, tu ad dexteram neis sedes, in gloria Patris, iudex crederis esse veneturus, te ergo quesumus tuis famulis subveni, quos preciosos sanguine redemisti. Eterna fac, cum sanctis tuis in gloria numerari, salvum fac populum tuum, Domine, et benedice hereditati tue, et regeus, et extolle illos, usque in aeternum. Per singulos dies benedicimus te, et laudamus nomen tuum in saeculum et in saeculum saeculi. Dignare Domine Deisto, sine peccato nos custodire. Miserere nostri Domine, miserere nostri. Fiat misericordia tua, Domine, super nos, quem ad modum speravimus in te. In te, Domine, speravi, non confundar in aeternum. Te Deum laudamus, te Deum laudamus, te Deum laudamus. What you noticed in singing that, I'm singing that in a room that has very poor acoustics, but that doesn't matter to me, because each singer, especially a cappella singers, know that they have within their own body, which is an instrument in itself, an internal acoustic. Where does this internal acoustic come from? I'm opening a short parenthesis to explain to you why I interpreted that the way I did. It comes from, first of all, the purity of the vowels. Whenever you heard an R, it was a pure R. Whenever you heard an E or an A, it was pure. Whenever you saw the Latin accent on the word, I stressed it. Now that gives it a strange and sort of this kind of mediocre acoustics, a strange kind of sound. But if I should sing this in a Romanesque church, you would understand every single word, because it must be perfectly articulated. You must pay attention to the Latin accent of the word and the phrase. You must pay attention to the pure production of pure vocal sounds. Okay? That's why and you will hear in the other Gregorian chant. This is a pre-Gregorian chant. As you see, it dates from the last part of the 4th century. It has carried many names. It is an anonymous hymn, probably of Irish origin, because the oldest manuscript, as you've read, that contains it is the Bongo antiphonary, which has a lacuna at the end of 3 verses. That's I'm talking about the text, the literary text. And the oldest manuscript that has the complete musical text is of the 12th century in the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris, which I've, of course, spent many hours in. Okay, after that, that's long. The Te Deum is very long. It took me a whole month to learn it by heart. I know it by heart, but I wanted to just sort of be leisure. When you have to sing a whole concert by heart, it's a lot of concentration. You know. So, let's continue. Now, I have not forgotten where we are. Before I attack the second capitula, the first Bible Charles showed, I will open this parenthesis on the de substantia numeri. Boethius, in his De Arithmetica 1, chapter 2, which is entitled De Substantia Numeri, in Greek, I arithmu ousia. Boethius gives us this extraordinary declaration. Omnia quecumque aprimaiva rerum natura constructa sunt numerorum videntur ratione formata. I'm giving, and you have the English translation right under. Hoc enim fuit principale in animo conditoris exemplar. Hinc enim quatuor elementorum multitudo mutata est, hinc temporum vices, hinc motus astrorum caelique conversio, quae cum ita sint, cumque omnia status numerorum colligatione fungatur, eium quoque numerum necesse est, in proprio semper sese habentem qualitas substantiae permaneri. All things in the universe, whatever they may be, were constructed and formed from the very beginning of time. So it seems, videntur, so it seems, based on the ratio of numbers. This, that is to say the ratio of numbers, without any doubt, was the principal and structural model in the mind of the Creator. Hence, from this principle, there came into being the plurality of the four elements. Hence, from the same principle came into being the change of season. Hence, as of the self-same principle, the movement of the heavenly bodies is produced. So, this being true, that is to say, inasmuch as all things are composed through the ratio of numbers, and inasmuch as the laws of nature and the constitution and essence of all created things function in close relationship to the ratio of numbers, Boethius, he's extraordinary. It is then indispensable for numbers to always remain permanently and uniformly in their own substance. That is to say, they must always remain rigorously within the logic of reasoning proper to the principle of numbers. Now, this is what we see illustrated in its most minute detail in this, which leads us to conclude that these people in this workshop, we are now in the year 844 through 851. This monastery, Benedictine monastery of Saint Boniface II, had already become, as of the beginning of the 9th century, a high quality manufacture of illuminated manuscripts. Of course, our beloved Alcuin was at the basis of all of this, because it is thought that he brought his, if not all, a part of his rich library with him from York, from the Cathedral of York, where he was the headmaster. And he was the one that was mandated by Charlemagne to come and educate the royal family in what they call la Scola Palatii, in Aachen, in Aix-la-Chapelle, and to make a blueprint for all the children, privileged or none, in his kingdom, and as of the year 25th of December 800, in his empire. He imposed this. This was a political, he imposed it, but that was his good side. And let's face it, he was redeemed by his good side, because you can have a whole international colloquium on the bad side of Charlemagne, because he was really one of those dictators. But he had a good side, and that redeemed him. You almost forget the bad side, okay? And in fact, as he approached the end of his life, he became repentant, and He regretted a lot of decisions that he made, and you know, when you study intimately the life of Charlemagne. Okay. Now, let's go to the Bible of Charles Le Chauve. Now, I told you about Neustria. This is Neustria. This is Saint Martin de Tours, which is the extreme boundary, southern boundary of Neustria. And the extreme eastern boundary is as it gets into what we call Alsace-Lorraine, the Alsatian part, the eastern part, which is known as Lotharingia, from Lothar, the oldest of the three grandsons of Charlemagne, the oldest of the three sons of Louis the Pious, who was the king of Lotharingia. Now, I told you about the Ordo Palatium. This is very important, because when we are talking about cultural politics, we're talking about power. And this is the way powerful heads of state understand culture. It's not, you know, give this guy a prize or make him a lord or you know, make her a dame of the British Empire. No, this is power. And of course, the British Empire and all of the empires understand this, that this is a tool of power, culture. When it's wisely used, it gives magnificent benefits to the entire population. It trickles down from the most privileged to the most underprivileged. And that is what Charlemagne understood. That redeems our Charlemagne, okay? So all of these Arras, Saint-Vaast, Saint-Médard, Saint-Marie de Soissons, Saint-Denis, Chelles, all of these are stations of the Ordo Palatii, and they are elements of governance. These heads of monasteries and heads of cathedrals, the bishops and archbishops, were governors. They legislated, they baptized, they you know, there are all kinds of archives. When you go into the archives, all kinds of charters and so forth, where they have the power to legislate regionally. And Charlemagne put them on this. You have Corbie, you have Saint-Omer, you have Saint-Amand. From all of these monasteries came magnificent erudite manuscripts, pedagogical manuscripts, and so forth. This is important. Okay, I don't need to insist on that anymore. Now let's go, and we're following our schema. Let's go and see what it looks like. This Bible of Charles the Bald. The first Bible, the number 2 Bible of the Latin collection, le Fonds Latin de la Bibliothèque Nationale, is the second Bible of Charles the Bald. In other words, these Bibles were fabricated in Saint Martin de Tours and given as gifts to Charles the Bald, who was king of Aquitania, and he later, at the end of his life, he became emperor. The last 2 years of his life, in 875 to 877, he died prematurely in 877 at the age of 54. He was coming back from Italy, going across the pass of the Saint Maurian Pass of the Alps, caught pneumonia and died at the age of 54. When Charles the Bald was 15, he became an adult. He had received 9 to 10 years of of erudite education from the young erudite Walafrid Strabon of Reichenau, the Reichenau Island in Bodensee, in the Lake of Constance, which is a part of Germany and not a part of Switzerland. The Reichenau Island, which was one of the, which was a part of the Ordo Palati, but on the German side. Louis the Pious had Walafrid Strabon to come and teach this boy from the age of 5 to the age of 15 everything. So what am I saying? That Charles the Bald understood every single thing that was in this manuscript. When he saw himself depicted in our, he knew everything. He was an erudite at 15, and at 15 he became one of the generals, and he went out to war and to lead the army at the age of 15. He was born in 823. And then, of course, you know, all of the intrigues against the wars, fraternal wars against his brothers, because each one wanted to become the next emperor. Lothar was warring, they were warring against each other. And then Louis the Germanic and Charles the Chauve leagued together against their oldest brother and came out of that alliance what is called the Oath of Strasbourg, which is the first known document of primitive French. The Oaths of Strasbourg. In French, they call it Les Serments de Strasbourg, and in German, die Strasburger Eide. Das Eid is in German means an oath, and this oath was pronounced in primitive French, in Althochdeutsch, and in Latin. Les Serments de Strasbourg. I wrote a very detailed article on it, which is on my website in Academia. You can read it at your leisure. Okay. Charles the Bald was himself erudite, but he did not choose to. He knew that he was groomed for power, so he chose that direction. Okay. Now, in this manuscript, there are 8 full-page illuminations and multiple what they call in French les lettrines, miniatures, ornate. This is the beginning of the book of Genesis. In principio creavit Deus caelum et terram. N'est-ce pas? That's the beginning of Genesis, and that's what this is. At the beginning of the famous, in the same manuscript, the beginning of the famous Gospel according to St. John, he says, also in principio, enarchi enologos, keologos en proston theon. That means in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. And in other words, John took off on the beginning of the Bible and made this is the very beginning of his gospel that he wrote at a very old age before he died. Okay, now I don't think I need to go into all that detail about this. Now, I'm going to give you here, this is where you can, this is a description of the 8 full-page illuminations in this manuscript that you can find on the websites as you see here. type on your research engine archive et manuscrit BNF, and then you type, or you can all you need to do is type Paris BNF Latin 1, and it will give you the extensive bibliography, all of this here. Then you have the Beta Biblissima of the Bibliothèque Nationale, which will give you extensively every single page in the, am I on the internet here?
Mhm.
Okay. This will give you every single page of the manuscript. Okay? So I don't need to, I've given you all of the, the indications. It's such a rich man. I am far from being a specialist on this manuscript. On this manuscript, I've spent thousands of hours in it, but I have a great friend, Guillaume Idrio. She's one of the finest art historians and medievalists of her generation. She's now 54 years old. She was born in 1964. She's almost 55. I've known her for about 13 or 14 years. When I discuss this with her, she opens this up and she just begins to analyze every single detail, the colors, the garments. Oh, it's wonderful to listen to her, and I just listen, So, but I, being a musicologist, saw in that folio 215 verso, which is the frontispiece of the Book of Psalms. This is extremely pertinent, that detail. I saw a tremendous proto-philological possibility and challenge. And this is what I'm bringing to you today, the fruit of almost 20 years of reflection and research. Okay? Now, let's make a little pause and hear some more music. Now, I'm going to sing for you now a Gregorian chant, which is not pre-Gregorian, it's Gregorian. It's the Tenebrae Facte Sunt. All of this music is extremely difficult. And I practice this music for years and years and years, and I practice every single day, because if you don't, it just won't come out when it's supposed to. Look on your Tenebrae Facte Sunt. You have all of the details of it. Tenebrae facte sunt, dum crucifixi center Iesum iudei, et circa oram nonam exclamavit Iesus, voce magna Deus meus, ut quid me reliquisti, tunc unus ex militibus lance alatus eius perforavit, et continuo exhibit sanguis, et et inclinato capite emisit spiritum et velum templicisum est assumosque deor sum et omnistera tremuit tunc ex militibus lancea latus eius perforavit et continuo exhibit sanguis et aqua et inclinato capite emisit spiritum. C'est un chant difficile. Okay, we're halfway through. Let's go back to our blueprint. Okay. Now, we talked about the philosophy of numbers and proportions, and now we're going to talk about the philosophy of musical sounds. And I'm going to bring on the screen this image. Now, for a musicologist, they understand that, and as of course Boethius for the what they call the Middle Ages. I prefer calling it the post-Roman period, but the Middle Ages, you know, it's a coined phrase. Why not use it? And when you think about the Carolingian Renaissance, they went back to the Roman. They tried to imitate the Roman imperial aesthetic and politics. Call it the Middle Ages. Of course, it's a coined phrase. I prefer the post-Roman period. All who study antiquity, musical antiquity, because all of this comes from the Pythagoreans. In other words, this image is Pythagorean and Platonic, fundamental. What was Boethius saying when he said, all things in the universe are based on the reasoning of numbers? He's right. If you want to imitate this table and replicate it, what do? The first thing, you measure it. You got to find the numbers of this table. How wide is it? How large is it? How thick is it? How high is it? If you want to imitate this, we don't have to go far. It is philosophy, of course, the philosophy of musical sound and the philosophy of proportions and numbers. But it's very simple. If you want to replicate anything, what is the first thing that you do? You measure it. That's what Boethius is saying when he says, that's what our man is saying when he says, omnia quaecumque, whatever it is, a primae vererum natura constructa sunt, numerorum videntur ratione formata. That is what he is saying. Why should it be any different? It's very simple, in fact. Okay, now let's go back to our image. In other words, here we go. An octave, called by the Pythagoreans I harmonia, and by Boethius I diapason. The ratio of an octave is 1 to 2. The ratio of a major second is, that means a whole tone, is 1.125. And of course, I add parenthetically that when you study acoustics, you know what is, you've heard the word hertz. Hertz. The hertz are based on the vibrations. And Hertz was a German physicist who was the same age practically as Max Planck. Max Planck lived to be 91 years old, and Hertz died at the age of 47. They were both born around 1850. 1851, 52. And it was this Hertz who invented the concept of Hertz. And the Hertz concept is based on the octave. 200 Hertz, 400 Hertz is an octave. As well. The tuning fork, Ave Maria, is based on 440, the one now is 440 vibrations, hertz. But of course, the tuning fork has not always been 440. Sometimes it was up to 523. Sometimes it was down to 398. It was decided upon maybe in 1964, 65. My memory is faulty on that date. That the diapason, what we call diapason in French, which is a fantastic word. It's a good word. The definition in English is, of course, a material definition. It looks like a fork. And it takes itself from the German Stimmgabel. The gabel is a fork that you eat with, Stimmgabel. And the diapason, or the tuning fork, which is an object of, it could be studied in extenso. It's an object of fantastic research. The tuning fork gives us the same vibrations as we find here in the overtones that the ear does not capture, but that machines can capture. Now, getting back, closing that inner parenthesis, getting back to Hertz. Hertz, of course, understood all of this. And I've had so many fruitful conversations with friends who are physicists, high-ranking physicists who understand this, and other conversations with musicologists that have not quite grasped that. When I met Richard, we understood that both, and we had tremendous exchange. You know, it was fantastic. So the intervals, as you heard in our in the Thai, you heard those micro intervals when they sing in the Thai type of singing, and you heard those micro intervals in the flutes, and also in the in the flutes of our Greek colleague that spoke on Skype. You heard them. So in other words, none of these intervals are sacred. The octave is not sacred. You can have an augmented octave or a slightly diminished octave. Doesn't mean it's false. It just means that you decide to give an effect of the voice. You understand? The fifth, there's nothing sacred about it, but it is a criteria. It is a criteria. 1, 2. The number is 1. And so everything is compared to 1. Why? Because 1 is the criteria. It was considered by Plato as the to enos, the unity, the absolute unity. 1 is the absolute unity. Why? Because in 1 are all of the intervals and all of the musical proportions and numbers in 1. You can prove it by dividing 1 into infinity, and you never get to 0. And you get all of the divisions that you get in leaving 1 and going towards infinity. If you divide 1 into 1/2, you get an octave. And so forth and so on. You understand? So 1 contains in itself all of the truth of mathematical and arithmetical truth. And that's why Plato called it to n, which is the all-inclusive thing. And he compared it to God, actually. He compared it to God. Okay, so these are I mentioned to you that the illumination was based on a perfect fourth, the proportions. Almost, it's 132, and the fifth is 1.5. This major 6 is 1.6875. The minor, the 7th is 1, the major 7th, and the octave. Okay? It's important to understand that. Okay? Okay? Now, the philosophy of Carolingian iconography and its protophilology. You read here what I wrote, De Institutione Imagini. That's an invention of mine. I like to invent terms. The name of Boethus' 2 major scientific philosophical treatises are, the first one, De Institutione Arithmetica Libri Duo. That means the institution or the fundamental teaching of arithmetic, of the science of numbers, in 2 books. That's all it means. And his musical treatise is called De Institutione Musica Quinque Libri. The fundamental institutional teachings of musical science and philosophy in 5 books. Okay? So I call this De Institutione Imagini. That means the fundamental teaching of imagery, iconography. Okay? You understand what I'm saying? An experimental and iconographical analysis based on the principle of the substantia numeri. Now you understand, after I gave all of those little parentheses, you understand better what that means. Okay? You understand better what that means. Let's talk about the summa bona. Go back to the image. Here in the corners, why did this artist, or why did this workshop deem it necessary to put in those corners the 4 quatuor virtutes animae? I don't know. But we know that in order to make a composition of this complexity, you're not a beginner. It's a tradition. It's been taught for at least 1 generation every day, day in and day out by someone who knew. And it came out in this image. It's extraordinary. Okay? It's extraordinary. I'm glad that it was there because it gives us an ethical. What is the laws of Plato? The laws of Plato is his last and greatest treatise. And it's on ethics, to ethikon. In Greek, many of the abstract terms are in neuter, right, James?
Yep.
Many are in neuter. To ethikon, ethics. Whereas in Latin it's already moralitas. In most all of the Romance language, it's a feminine. It's a feminine word. But in Greek, it's very interesting. It's neuter. To ethikon. That adds to this complex image something extraordinary. Okay, now let's take another pause. Alleluia Pascha Nostrum, which is probably the most beautiful single song in the Gregorian repertoire, and as I've given you the dates and everything, you have it on your program. It's a very hard song to sing. It's sung by soloists, but it's also sung by the choir. But the soloist intervenes in the verse. But even the Alleluia itself, everything is hard in this song. You got to manage your breathing. You got to manage everything. Okay. Alleluia. Pascha nostrum Short, but it's quite a song. Quite a song. Okay, now these personages, I would be remiss not to give you an analysis of these personages. Okay, let's look at them. Let's look at them. And the image itself. The image itself. Okay. This image presupposes a Pythagorean and Platonic influence. And we see this because of the arithmetical proportions and their musical equivalences, of its geometrical composition, and of its philosophical symbolism on the whole. In effect, in a subtle presentation, it contains all of the elements of the quintessential cultural heritage of the Pythagoreans and of the Platonic era. David Rex et Propheta is written over the head of Charles de Gaulle. David Rex et Prop with an abbreviation sign over the P, which means that they left out H-E-T-A, David, King, and Prophet. Okay? David, let's start with David. He has a 15-chord, you don't see it well in this image, a 15-chord trigone in his hand, which means that he is, the 15-chord trigone means that he has the 15-note scale, the 15-note scale. David is in the middle as if he were the sun, and as you see this, you see it's almost, you can see the movement in a clockwise, as if they're all revolving around this central figure. The different personalities which we see around David are two guards, bodyguards, and their names are given over their heads or next to their bodies. Sereti and Feleti, which is in 1 Chronicles 18:16, verse 16. 1 Chronicles 18, verse 16 and 17. The four musicians which are playing, Asaph, from top, Asaph, Aiman, on bottom, Ethan, Editun. And you can find this in 1 Chronicles 6, 33 to 44. And in 1 Chronicles 15, 17 through 19, and 16, 41 and 42. The instruments of music are the trigon, trigonos, or psalterion, or kithara, in the hands of David. You have the keras, and these names are given in the Bible, in the book of Chronicles. Paradipomena, that's the name of Book of Chronicles in Greek. In the Greek, I hebdomikonta, that means the Septuagint version. Tokeras, O Aulus, I lyra, I Kimbalia, here, you see? So we have identified all of the personages and all of the musical instruments. We have, if you compare, as I said earlier, the different subtle triangles. This is called a mandorla. Mandorla comes from probably the Italian word. I think it's the same word in Spanish. Yeah, the mandorla. What you see here is actually the result of two converging circles, which is the form that is given in the very first chapter of the Ta Stichia, the elements of Euclid. That's the very first figure that is given. He takes two circles and makes them converge, and in the middle is the mandorle. Here you're going to find you'll have parallelograms, you'll have subtle triangles. It's all a composition, a geometrical composition. All you need to do is just spend time and put your ruler there and say, okay, that's it. And all of these things will add up to something extremely coherent. This is a very complex and very sophisticated, as they like to say, sophisticated. You know what I mean? That means that it comes from a very source of wisdom. When you say this is very sophisticated, actually what that means, that this is a very complex ensemble that comes from a source of wisdom, a codified source of wisdom. That's what sophisticated means, okay? Now let's do our last musical pause, and then I will make my conclusion, okay? Victime Pascali Laudes. This is the sequence, it's called in Latin sequentia cum prosa, that follows the Alleluia in the Mass of the Easter day. It was written in around 1050 by Wipo the Burgundian. In other words, it was not sung as of the end of the 7th century or the beginning of the 9th century, where the Alleluia is attested. It is attested, as I've given to you in that. But it was put into the Mass in the 11th century. So as you see, Gregorian chant evolved as you come down from the, let's say, the third, 4th century, all the way down to the 12th, 13th century, where polyphony, organum, and so forth is in full sway, where you're having 2 voices, 3 voices, and so forth, and it's in full sway, and you have treaties that are being written about organum and polyphony and so forth, all the way down until you get down to the very sophisticated, there's that word again, music of Guillaume de Marshal in the 14th century. He was born in 1300 and he died in 1377. He was we talked about Guillaume de Marshal the other day in northern France. And of course, many others. Okay, Victime Pascali Laudes. Victime Pascali Laudes, immolent Christiani. Anius redemit oves, Christus innocens patri, reconciliavit peccatores. Mors et vita duello, confixere mirando, dux vitae mortus regnat vivus. Dic nobis Maria, quid vidisti in via, sepulcrum Christi vivendetis, et gloriam vidi resurgentis, angelicos testes, sudarium et vestes, surrexit Christus spes mea, precedet suos in Galileam. Scimus Christum surrexisse, aur tuis fere, tu nobis victor rex miserere. Amen. Alleluia. As I was singing, I just remembered that I forgot a song. I skipped the Quem Quiritis. So I'm going to sing that to you right on the cusp of the other. These two are similar because they are what we call versus or trope or clausulae. In other words, these are paraliturgical pieces that have been composed by different people. The Quem Quiritis was composed by Odon of Cluny, who was the second abbot of the famous Benedictine Abbey of Cluny, and he died at the age of 927. He composed the Quem Quiritis, which is the basis of what is called the liturgical drama and one of the ancestors of the opera. Like the Victimae Paschali Laudes, it is a dialogue between, and it treats the resurrection of Christ. The Victimae Paschali Laudes is Mary coming and her two girlfriends coming to embalm the body of Christ, and the angel says to them, he's not here. He's resurrected as he predicted himself. Okay, I forgot to do the Quem Quiritis. This is a very important Gregorian chant. It is a trope. Quem Quiritis in sepulchro Christe colle, Iesum Lazarenum crucifixum, o celi colle, non est hic surrexit sicut predixerat, ite nuntiate quia surrexit. Alleluia ad sepulcrum residens, Angelus nunciat, resurrexis Christum, ennece completum est, illud quod olim ipse per prophetam dixerat ad patrem, taliter in quiens resurrexit, which is the beginning of the introit anthem of the Easter Day Mass, Resurrexit. Okay? And that's sung just before the introit. And it became, as of a century later, it became one of the main plays, paraliturgical plays that everyone sang all over the empire. And it soon left the church and went out in the front of the church, and then it soon became a procession, elaborate procession down the streets, and mainly at the Easter period. And it was always ended with the Te Deum Laudamus. You have that in the things. And one last parenthesis concerning the Te Deum Laudamus. It was sung at the coronation of the Carolingian kings and emperors. We have the example in 816 by Teganus who wrote the life of Louis the Pious, and he indicates that Louis the Pious, when he was crowned emperor in 816 in the city of Reims, how do you say Reims in French, in English? Reims.
Reims, yes.
Reims. The Te Deum was sung. Okay? Now, rapidly, the word of conclusion. The word of conclusion. After an attentive examination of this image, we see that the scientific philosophical tradition of knowledge is represented in all its subtle elements in a very quintessential way. And we see the Pythagorean, Platonic, Aristotelian influences. We see this, the word was used this morning by someone else, the syncretism of 33 generations. That means about 1,000 years, 30 or 40 generations from Plato down to Charlemagne. In this image, we see that this was made possible by the one who Aegina qualified, via undecumque doctissimus, that means Alcuin of York, the man who is in all respects completely erudite and completely knowledgeable. We see that in the powerful ethical Platonic teaching of the four double virtues are represented here, giving this extraordinary image a value that will nourish our, regardless of the era in which we are specialized, that will nourish our proto-philological research, which means archaeological research, of imagery, of sound that is silent sound, which it challenges us to find out what is being said in this unspoken, subtle declaration. Okay? Thank you for your attention. And it's been an honor and a pleasure for me to be here with you. Thank you.